and NATO on feminist approaches on democracy. You joined right on time. Gabrielle currently holds two professional positions. She is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology in DC, where she studies the intersection of democracy, technology, and gender equality. And she's also the principal and the founder of Herizon. Can we comment on what a wonderful acronym that is before we even start? Herizon Democracy, which aims to mainstream feminist approaches to international democracy assistance. Because in Gabrielle's own words, democracy as we know it and support it around the world often replicates structures of oppression, which will be the focus of her talk today, titled Advancing Women and Diversity in Global Democracies. A quick reminder to our virtual guests, please include your questions in the queue. Dr. Mike Kenny and I will make sure that we will include them in the discussion following Dr. Bardall's talk. I would also like to take this very moment to thank Sandy Monteverde for making this talk possible with her expert logistical planning and again, feeding our souls and helping us feed our minds. Gabrielle, without further ado, thank you for making the trip again to Pitt. And we're looking forward to this discussion very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for coming today. Thank you, Sandy, also for the magnificent logistical support and getting me here from the wilds of South Jersey at the moment where I am with my family. I am delighted to be here today to talk about a gendered analysis and where gender analysis comes into play in international affairs and international development, specifically the gender dimensions of building democracy. And of providing support to democracy and electoral processes around the world. So I'll try to keep to time. I'm going to talk a bit explaining why it's important, and then talk about what it looks like in practice, including where we're at today and where we're headed. So there's a bit of conceptual, a bit of practical, and hopefully lots of time for questions and answers. So yeah, let's get started. I grew up protesting. I don't know about you. I grew up protesting in a family of protesters. I was still in a stroller when my mom took me out to the anti-nuclear proliferation rallies and the, I'm going to date myself, but the G7 movements and the anti and alter globalization movements were really influential to me as I was starting out. And when I find out that permanently speaking out for democracy and like working to support democracy was a day job, man, was I happy. And that's because democracy is really kind of a prerequisite for almost every other field of development. I was speaking at lunch to some graduate students, and we were talking about, try everything now and figure out where you fit. And that's definitely what I did. Through my college years, I tried refugee work and education and health and humanitarian things. And in all of these different situations, it felt like it always came back down to democracy and governance. If you don't have peace, if you don't have stability, if you have corruption, you're never going to achieve sustainable results in these other sectors. So to me, that was why this became so important. And I have ever since been working in the field that we call international democracy systems. Now, is this going to go forward? I'm not sure. There we go. Okay, very good. So what is international democracy assistance? I'll start with a quick definition. Whoops, it's missing. We'll leave it there because it's not a field that is well known to everyone. But essentially, in the U.S. alone, we spend over $10 billion every year supporting democratic processes and institutions in other countries abroad, either post-conflict states, states emerging from authoritarian rule, or states that are just trying to do better in addressing their international commitments on human rights and on participation. It is a key area of development assistance and foreign policy, not only in the U.S. but in most countries that provide aid, and it is seen as a key tool for promoting global peace, stability, and prosperity. So we're paying for this with our aid money, whether or not we all are aware of it. It's often more of a quiet form of international aid. So democracy is great. Who doesn't want democracy. It first dawned on me that in doing all this good, maybe we weren't doing the same good for everyone with the democracy assistance. About 15 years ago, I was managing a database on incidents of election violence. And at the time, kind of on a whim almost, I decided to disaggregate it by gender, found out, wow, the types of violence that men are perpetrating on other men in these political contexts is just that. Like what we think of as election violence and political violence, that's what men are doing to other men to keep power, to gain power, to control the political space. Women's experience of election violence is totally different. And from that point forward, I've been applying a gendered analysis systematically through everything I do in democracy work. I never considered myself a gender expert. My home base is democracy. But today you really can't separate the two. And you'd think the relationship would be obvious, right? Like gender and democracy, peas and carrots, peanut butter and jelly. They just go together. But actually, not really. Democracy is generally built by men for men. In fact, someone within the US government told me last week that we're still building democracy for men. We pack a lot of aspirations, values, dreams, and hopes into the idea of democracy, and that's the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do. That's why I get up in the morning and go to work. But we can't forget that democracy is fundamentally a power sharing arrangement, right? In the places that I work, it's usually a solution to negotiate the end of a conflict and to achieve peace. And once the weapons are set down, once the actors stop shooting each other and agree to govern through ballots and votes, you know, some may say that it's case closed, time to go home, democracy has been achieved. All that's left to do is to make sure that people continue to follow the rules and that they follow the process. But, you know, who's writing the rules? Who's designing that process and who's really benefiting from it? And I'm going to say it's these guys. It's the men who were often toting guns not that long ago and who have recaptured political power and space through the conflict transition and are now holding that electoral space. And so that's what we'd call a minimalist view of democracy. And it is, in my perspective, a very short-sighted point of view. Gender analysis is the most powerful tool that I'm aware of to break this cycle and to prevent democracy and democratic transitions from replicating these power structures that were the basis of war and conflict in the first place. And so I'm here today to talk a little bit about how that happens and what that looks like in practice. This is still happening as we speak, right? So as I said, gender and democracy seems easy enough. Both terms tend to conjure up kind of warm and fuzzy feelings for political scientists and politicians, so far as politicians and political scientists are warm and fuzzy. And despite what I just said about the kind of cold, hard bottom line of democracy, it is a word that continues to inspire. And that's the same for gender and democracy. People, rightly or wrongly, continue to associate women's leadership with kinder, softer, less corrupt ways, and are always going to promote women's rights in that regard. This is from Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy that says promoting women and girls will obviously lead us to peace, to inclusivity, to prosperity, because that's what happens when women are in power, obviously, right? So virtually all democracy assistance is based on assumptions like this, that transitions to democracy or progress towards greater levels of democracy will necessarily bring about progress for women, and that women in power will necessarily bring about all these social reforms and benefits and economic prosperity that we all dream of. And it is such a fundamental relationship that we almost never, ever question it, especially those of us working in the democracy space. Women's rights are human rights. Human rights is democracy. Democracy protects human rights. You know, it is just self-evident, right? That all men are created equal. All white, landowning men, and definitely not the women. No, I mean, even from our founding documents, we can see that democracy is an evolution, and it's something that we really need to work for. gender and democracy have been on a long, long road of coming together. And I'm working now today at continuing to bring that road closer together. So two things. Why apply a gender lens to democracy assistance? I'll argue for two reasons. First of all, as you may have guessed, my perspective on this is that democracy does not automatically necessarily in every situation guarantee better outcomes for women unless intentional action is taken. And that starts by understanding exactly where democracy is failing women. We know that participation requires more than token participation. And even token participation can be hard to get in a lot of places. At the most basic level, women face distinct barriers from things like registering to vote, to accessing the information they need to make independent decisions and whatnot. Today, 85% of democracies in the world are still led by men. That's almost the same number as non-democracies, just a little bit worse. And we're still nearly a century away from seeing gender equality and gender parity in the world's parliaments. The barriers women face to run for office are legion. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And we also see from countries, from Honduras to Zimbabwe, Myanmar, Tunisia, women's movements are often sidelined after democratic transitions take place. We see, like in Sudan, women are carrying the flag, they're leading the movement to achieve democracy. But once that achievement takes place, we're back to those tables with all the guys around them and the political processes that follow. More and more academic research demonstrates that this is not an automatic link. That academic research is not translating into the policy space yet. And it's something we really need to understand more closely. We need to understand that women leaders, journalists, even civil servants are often targeted by gender-based political violence and hate speech across the globe here, as well as in almost any other country you can name. And this participation, it doesn't guarantee positive change. Democracy, like real on the ground, hands in it, democracy is not gender neutral. It's just not. It will not automatically improve women's situation, nor will it automatically include women's perspectives in their leadership or their priorities unless we take action. The second reason we need to apply gender lens to democracy assistance is purely strategic. And I talked about this a bit with Mugge. Feminists don't always like to hear me say this because gender discrimination, gender violence is against women because they are women. And yes, that is at the heart of this, but it is also purely political strategy in some cases. We see that autocratic regimes are regularly employing gender washing, I'm going to call it, as a strategy to masquerade as democracies, but in fact, they're repressing dissident women, they're jailing women in opposition, they're using deep fakes to sexualize and demean opposition women candidates. They're not pro-women, they're not feminists per se, they're manipulating it. The gendered nature of this, of autocratic use of feminist terms, of gender ideas, it is strategic, it presents an illusion of democracy, and it's just another tactic that we should be recognizing with all the other types of tactics that dictators use to pretend to be democracies. And thinking otherwise, in my mind, is a bit naive. So not to call the Canadian foreign policy naive, but thinking that all women all the time in every context is just going to be perfect doesn't recognize the reality of what dictators in the world are using today to get around those rules. For example, Rwanda has got the world's largest percentage of women in parliament, yet it is an authoritarian state that represses critical feminine voices, that marginalizes opposition women parties. The example about deep faking a woman candidate, that's Rwanda straight up, running against Kagame in the last few years. So this comes about because there's not a coordination, there's not communication between the democracy actors and the feminist actors. And also because the West, writ large, has a bit of a sexist blind spot as far as this is concerned, because we still just want to have that warm and fuzzy view about women in politics. And so it is something that we need to be aware of from a strategic perspective. And increasingly, as bad as this is about, pretending to be feminist, what we're seeing also with the rise of populism, is that folks are coming straight out and being anti-feminist, misogynistic, using sexism to divide us, to create dissent within our within Western democracies or emerging democracies as a way of wedging that divide even further. And those tactics end up diverting our attention from other human rights violations and so forth. So there's both a strategic reason and a human rights-based reason to understand how to integrate these topics more thoroughly. So, understanding how these bad actors are using genders is a part of the work of a gender analysis. It's part of applying that gendered lens to democracy assistance. So let's take this apart a little bit. That's most of the conceptual part. I promised I was going to keep it short. Let's take it apart a little bit and look at some examples about how we integrate gender perspectives in practice into this work of democracy assistance. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we came from, where we're at, and then going further, where we need to go, in my humble opinion, to continue that journey towards bringing these spaces together. So you're all scholars, you know very well that development practitioners have been evolving in their approach on gender issues for decades now. Initially, the women in development approach in the 1970s and 80s was replaced by the gender and development approach because it's critical of viewing women again as a homogenous group, although it's far, and for failing to address these underlying inequalities in the power structures that govern us. And the gender and development approach of the 1980s and 1990s introduced us to things that are super influential in what we do today. Gender mainstreaming is from that space, and has been profoundly influential. And this gender and development approach showed up on the scene about the same time as democracy assistance as we know it today really took off. End of the Cold War, early 1990s, a lot of these democracy organizations come to life and start implementing this. So the world of practice of democracy assistance emerged just when we were starting to understand gender mainstreaming. And at the time, we're talking a lot about liberal democracy, right? This is the end of history. And with that, end of democracy, or end of history, not end of democracy, end of history, liberal democracy approach brought us the world of liberal feminism, which has dictated much of the way that gender analysis that has been applied to democracy assistance for all of these years. So I know, sorry. Mitt Romney's famous binders full of women. Liberal feminism emphasizes descriptive representation. It's a lot about numbers. It's about empowering individual women to rise and to enter that space. Now, I show Mitt here lovingly, because actually, although liberal democracy gets a bad rap, or not democracy, liberal feminism gets a bad rap, and there's a lot of problems with it, which I will talk about. It has been a helpful entry point, I'm going to say, in this space. It sets understandable and easy to explain goals and targets and measurements. It is culturally acceptable, I'm going to say, to the democracy community that may be less versed in other feminist spaces and language, because it does talk about the individual empowerment. It talks about working with the structures that we know and that we're familiar with and making them more equal and representative, which is, of course, the bottom line here. And it has brought us really very helpful changes in the democracy space. So, for example, the electoral cycle model, this is kind of the bread and butter of elections assistance work. We view election cycles as cycles, that's repetitive, starting with what happens in the pre-electoral period or the preparatory phase. Lots of work to define legal structures, define your boundaries and your circumscriptions for voting, your campaigns, your voter and civic education. We work in the electoral period where you're dealing with polling station arrangements, where you're counting and transmitting results and things like this. And then in the inter-electoral period, where so much other things go on, your electoral commissions and bodies who are my most frequent clients, I'll say, are upgrading their technologies, they're doing institutional strengthening, they're working on the recruitment policies, things like this. This is the gender blind approach to electoral assistance. That is a core part of democracy work. But when we go in and we apply a gendered lens to all of this, it brings out so much richness of the type of work that we can actually be doing in these spaces to reinforce women's participation throughout to mainstream it. So these are just a few examples of a gendered lens to that electoral cycle. You can see that when you're registering your voters, that's totally gender dependent. You know, in some countries where I've worked, people will travel up to a week in one country to have their voter registration card printed. Why? Because they've never had an identity card before. And the ability to have chosen a technology that'll print a card out instantaneously rather than having to come back for it weeks later is night and day. Women can do that because it's one trip. Whereas if they're having to travel such a long distance twice, they're much less likely to do it. It's just too much time away, they can't afford it, childcare, et cetera. Likewise with the photos, this can be a really gender sensitive issue. A lot of countries require that voter lists be publicly posted for verification, transparency measure. In some countries, we've seen that from these public boards, women's faces will be cut out. They'll just snip it away on the posters. And we found two reasons. One, because cultural sensitivities, they don't want their face public, which is perfectly reasonable. And whoever planned that law or that measure that required that should have thought of that perhaps in the first place, or also because they've never had a photo taken before. And this is a memento. But that impacts the legitimacy then of those voter lists and whether or not they can be used. So little considerations like this start creeping in to the actual applied practice of working to develop these systems and processes around elections, around democracy, from that gendered angle. I could go on, but essentially every single element of what we do in an electoral cycle will have some type of gender dimension to it. It just requires the thought, the research, the engagement to understand what that gender dimension is and how to integrate it successfully so that it actually does contribute to women's participation. And a lot of publications and things I've worked on, like this one, are starting to gather these findings and provide guidance and recommendations to actors that are working in this space. So that's one from UN. So interventions like this that are really about gender mainstreaming into the institutions that we all know and love of democracy, they help respond to many of the shortcomings that I was talking about earlier. They bring more women decision makers in as voters, as civil servants, as decision makers and elected officials. And they're increasingly addressing the barriers that women are facing, like those I just mentioned. These interventions are necessary, but I'll say they're also insufficient to achieving the ultimate outcome of political gender equality. They are all a part of what I would still kind of generally categorize as this fuzzy relationship between democracy and gender. Like, we know that more is good, but what's the ultimate goal and what does it look like? And like those questions haven't necessarily been answered in the democracy space. So there's a few pressure points, I'll say, that are kind of pushing us forward away from this gender and development framework towards a feminist approach to democracy. For one, the rise in autocracy and populism that I've already talked about. It's still not widely acknowledged or accepted in practitioner circles, but the more we look at what's going on around the world, the Marine Le Pens, the Marjorie Taylor Greens and others, like folks are going to see this emerge in populist movements and radical wings of political parties. And it will be more and more difficult to make the argument that all women are always promoting pro-women policies and greater social inclusion and whatnot. Also understanding the shortcomings in liberal feminism. Sorry again for the bad jokes, but this notion of liberal feminism that has served us well, thus far, has a lot of drawbacks. Even though this add women and stir, that's what they call it, approach, it wasn't a given when we started out. So it has helped people progress on that journey. As one colleague told me, it's allowed us to introduce the F word, feminism, into democracy assistance, something that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. But as these feminist foreign policies that are emerging around the world, they are increasingly pushing towards transformative feminist goals. They're talking about addressing power structures. They're talking about intersectionality. These things, if you start adding these goals to the mix, you have a problem with liberal feminism and these approaches. Critics of liberal feminism will argue that the focus on individuals, it masks the ways that social structures, institutions, and political processes, that these larger things are disadvantaging women. It liberates individual women, but women ultimately remain dependent on a patriarchal state. One way of describing it is that democracy, the add women and stir approach to democracy is fundamentally incompatible with feminism because it offers women a piece of the pie as currently and poisonously baked, which is an interesting and effective way to describe it. Other feminists coming from post-colonial traditions, Black feminists, they will also spurn liberal feminism because they see it as propagating a white savior complex instead of recognizing that diverse power dynamics are at play with multiple and overlapping identities and sources of oppression. So in other words, this framework of liberal democracy and liberal feminism that we've been working with so far, however problematically, it is inherently incapable of transforming these power relationships and of achieving intersectional goals. So that's kind of the crossroads that we're at now, and we're at the heart of seeing these countries that are doing democracy assistance, that have adopted feminist approaches. We're watching them wrangle with how to manage this, and right now I think it could go either way. We may just say, oh, we tried it, let's go back to our comfortable liberal space and just call it a day, or maybe things will go further. But there is a current trend towards feminism in democracy. Good, the red part came out big enough. I was worried about that. A feminist approach to democracy assistance aims to challenge and to transform unequal power relationships, to eliminate gendered and patriarchal structures that are perpetrating this oppression and this inequality. And it's over a dozen countries now that have adopted a feminist approach, either to international development assistance or to their foreign policies. So this is happening. What are the implications? There's a lot of debate over whether or not it's useful in democracy. You'll never guess, happen to think that it's very useful. It's powerful because it makes us think about what we're doing and how and why. Nothing is going to light a fire under us like this type of thinking will. And the world of democracy assistance is changing so much and so profoundly in the face of these new threats, whether coming from new technologies, coming from rising authoritarianism. We need to think about what we're doing from a really critical perspective and do better. And feminism helps us. So that's why I'm a fan. From a conceptual point of view, we're seeing a growing use of what I'll call feminist institutionalist approaches and solutions. So feminist institutionalism aims to transform power relationships by working within existing institutions and power structures to reduce inequality, to enhance women's rights, and so forth. This is a really useful lens. These are the goals that weren't explicitly said before, and that previous gender lenses on democracy couldn't really accommodate. So in my mind, this is an obvious next step. It is not consistently applied. It causes a huge amount of debate and controversy. A lot of people who have spent their careers in democracy assistance will look at some feminist institutional solutions and say, hell no. But others are increasingly being used, especially from a piecemeal perspective. So before I conclude, I would just show you a few examples from practice of what these are looking like. Again, we're talking about transforming institutions and not just promoting individuals within existing systems. So coming back to this inclusive electoral management bodies, not only are we looking at how to insert women into the process by reducing barriers to voting, to candidacies, et cetera, but we're talking about changing electoral management bodies themselves, the institutions that run elections. So that's by internal gender assessments and audits within the institutions, developing action plans, changing your staffing at the leadership level, your recruiting practices at the grassroots level, changing the institutional culture within these spaces. I was talking at lunch. It is possible to change institutional culture. My husband is an academic, but also a volunteer firefighter in both Canada and in South Jersey. And he was noting in Canada, they have really strict institutional culture rules about sexist jokes. And they will come down on you if you crack jokes like this. And there's a fair amount of women, an increasing amount of women on the fire department in South Jersey. Not that I don't love New Jersey, but they don't have that. And he's found it to be a very sexist environment, and there are no women there whatsoever. They cannot bring them in because of the culture. So institutional cultures can change, the rules matter, and there's no place more important in my mind than electoral management bodies in particular, because they are the ones that are ultimately shaping what democracy looks like in different countries. So, working within these electoral management bodies, quotas are a huge one. They still face a huge amount of resistance, especially in, I'm going to say, the US democracy system space, very sensitive, but they work, at least when they're well designed and when they're used appropriately within the broader electoral legal framework. So gender quotas are one of the major ways that this landscape is reshaping. Another approach that's gaining in use. In fact, I guess one of our colleagues is heading to Scotland to look at this in practice shortly. Gender-sensitive parliaments, re-examining the parliamentary space as an institution, the processes that define it, the processes that define how decisions are made and taken, and ensuring that that space is gender-sensitive, that there's space to hear views from across these broad spectrums. The violence against women in politics question. Now, I don't have time to talk about this one, but Rudy knows that I can talk about it for years, probably. Back to where I started in this whole space, looking at gender violence or election violence from a gender perspective, this is fundamental. Women face extraordinary levels of political violence and electoral violence that are driving them out of the political space or other leadership spaces, journalism, et cetera. At an alarming rate, it is generally not recognized, it is not protected against. And there's very little legally that can be done to prevent it in most places, including here. So understanding that this is a fundamental factor driving this inequality and shaping the space that defines our democracies is really critical. And there's a growing body of literature on it over the years that is understanding it better and talking about solutions to it. I won't go into the details, but these guides, again, we break it down usually through this electoral cycle perspective and identify individual entry points across the board on how it can be addressed and prevented through the work of democracy assistance. Same with political parties, they're the gatekeepers to power. We rely on them to decide who we're going to choose. In a lot of these countries, from the start of the slides there, where all the former rebels and militias and who not are sitting around the table, it's usually their parties, a lot of places that have taken shape as political parties after a conflict. So transforming those spaces and making them not only accessible to women, but helping women redefine what they are, how they function, how they operate, and how they engage with constituents is a key feminist institutionalist approach, I'll say, that's reshaping the democracy landscape. Same thing here, break it down into individual actions and entry points for practical work. All this is available online if you want to read the fine text. So Yeah, I'll wrap up here. Just my recommendations on where I see this going in the future. If we meaningfully want to get closer to a feminist approach to democracy and to democracy assistance, which I most sincerely hope we will see. A few recommendations. First, applying the women, peace, and security agenda beyond the conflict stage. So often we see, I mean, it's even hard enough to get women into these conflict negotiation spaces, as you saw from some of the photos. But even when they get in there, once the peace deal is signed, we often are like, okay, over to you, democracy, you've got it covered. And done. So women, peace, and security needs to apply throughout democratic transitions, throughout democratization processes. It's not, there's not a stop sign on that agenda. I also argue that we need to measure democracy and political gender equality with intersectional standards, and not only the intersectional standards that we talk about most frequently in academia, but also socioeconomics and political pluralism. We cannot simply provide a support to women in politics without recognizing that in most of these countries where we're dealing with authoritarian spaces, we're often helping women who are with incumbent parties. Like there's not political balance always, and that women in opposition groups face much deeper competition and access to resources and things. It has to address economics, it has to address politics. This is absolutely aspirational, and I dream of the day we'll see it. We need to end the double standard for elections, election standards and democratization processes. How often have you seen an election observer report come out and say, polls were great, counting was great, everything was free and fair, but 16% of women were elected, and a handful of women were able actually to vote after all this violence and other obstacles. So it's a democracy, it's free and fair. That's still how we're measuring democracies. I dream of the day that we will see election observation reports and others come out and say, despite all these other great things, this is a deeply unequal and unjust space. And so this is not a democracy. We are going to suspend our favorite trade relationships with you. We are going to sanction you. We are going to end our arms deals with you until you get your act together on gender. There's a double standard. We're not there. And so that to me has to change. Yeah, we have to address issues like violence against women in politics, political finance, another huge space. And we need to look inwards within the democracy assistance community. Almost none, if possibly none, of the democracy assistance organizations out there are led by women. They never have been. It needs to start at home. And the organizations that are doing this work need to practice what they preach. So I will stop there. Okay. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you so much, Dr. Bardall, for that fascinating and important set of remarks. We have a great group of people here. I'm sure many of you have questions for Dr. Bardall, either about the presentation or about our work. I have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll get the ball rolling. One thing that you mentioned near the end that struck my, that got my attention, I'm hoping maybe you can elaborate on, because when I was preparing for this, I went, took a look at Herizon's Democracy website and came across, one of your op-eds, and I was really struck by your observation about, in terms of helping to move things forward, one thing that governments need to think about doing is to include, and so I'm reading Dr. Bardall's piece on this. This includes leveraging the tools of diplomacy and international relations, preferential trade status, arms sales, sanctions, to achieve equality goals. I thought that was a really interesting idea. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that for us.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's connected to one of the final points I made about the double standards that we have. We say democracy is advancing human rights, but we're not advancing all human rights at the same pace. Some are more important than others. And until we start viewing women's rights as equally important as some of these other fundamental things, we won't get there. And we need to put our money behind our speak. You know, if countries violate some of these basic principles, there are consequences to pay. That's the whole existence of international frameworks, and the international normative frameworks are intended to hold states to account, but we don't hold them to account where gender is concerned. It's always like, oh, I'll do better next time. It's soft, or it's cultural, but it's not, and it's becoming increasingly strategic in my mind. So, yeah, I do look for a day when we will start holding women's rights to the same standards as the other rights that are fundamental to democracy.
So what might that look like in practice? Like, just want to, you know, because I think it's a fascinating idea. So, for example, the US, we obviously sell arms to the entire world. So this could be a condition for future arms sales. If a certain country, you know, doesn't have like what, a certain proportion, or like what I'm just trying to.
It's definitely aspirational. I mean, we continue to sell arms and have arms negotiations with plenty of states that are deeply not democratic. So
Yeah,
start with that.
right.
But yeah, I mean, we've suspended trade relations over a variety of different human rights violations in different places. Add this to the list. Yeah,
Okay.
it's as simple as that. Like, I'm not saying that we're consistent. I'm not saying that we're even there with non-gendered democratic principles, but this is not even on the horizon at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, put it on the agenda. Yeah. Yeah. So is there a hand there? Oh, yes, please. Dr. Howard.
Hi, thank you so much for this interesting talk. My name is Mindy Hawes. I'm an assistant professor from GISPIA. My question is, you know, to the extent you said some of these transformative policies are aspirational, right? Do we have to sort of go through some of those liberal policies to get to these transformative policies, or are some of these liberal or smaller changes better for environments where democratization might be more unlikely?
It's a great question. Speaking from a democracy practitioner point of view, I would like to see this community that I'm a part of say what they want, set the objectives, say the goals. Like, this is where we finally want to get. Is it just gender parity in Parliament? I think it's more than that. You know, men and women and people of all genders can be feminists. Women in so many countries support patriarchy. We need to break it down. It's not just about the numbers anymore. It's about the values and, yeah, the social justice values that are a part of this more inclusive space. So that's not explicit in the democracy assistance community. We are still back at that Canadian slide, which is more women will bring us peace and money. And that's inaccurate. In terms of what it actually looks like on the ground, yes, and I say aspirational because I won't see it in my lifetime. Yeah, liberal feminism helps us inch forward towards these goals, but if we're not careful, it can be used against us. I described a situation to some of the students at lunch where I was invited to as a gender analyst for a country that was at like 29.4% women in parliament or something like that, and they brought me into like, hey, how do we get 0.6%? Because we'll tick it off the sustainable development goals. We'll get our trade, you know, we'll get more money because we're more democratic, blah, blah, blah. So like, give us a report on how to get 6% or 0.6%. And I was like, no, you know, you guys have jailed all the women in position in the country. Like, sexism is no. If you want to achieve political gender equality, there's all of these other things that need to happen first. And so if we set goals that are too simplistic that allow authoritarian states to tick that box, we'll actually be working against ourselves. So we need to smarten up as a democracy assistance community, set real goals for ourselves and understand what it is that we actually want in terms of feminism and gender and democracy, and then work appropriately towards those goals. And at the moment, I do feel that it's fuzzy, and that there's no clear framework for what the outcome should look like.
I don't want to take up the space to jump in, so I'll happily wait for my. Yes, please. I'll happily wait.
I was just not calling. Hi, thanks so much. I'm Michaela. I'm a first year PhD student at Columbia. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you think we can exercise, or the community of practitioners in the development space can exercise the most leverage. So like specifically thinking about, for example, the war in Ukraine, right? Hopefully at some point that will come to a peaceful end, or the war will end. Is that a kind of place where you would think about trying to exercise some of these changes to bring women to the table in that negotiation for peace? And how would you think about going about that?
So I did a big study on Syria not too long ago, and it's obviously also in the midst of conflict. And what the Syrian women I spoke to were saying was that, again, gender is second tier. There are such pressing needs, you know, people are dying, there's things being blown up, like our children are hungry. We need to deal with those things first, and like we'll get to gender equality when we get to it. I don't think that's a long-term plan. What academic research shows us is that if women's don't achieve certain fundamental rights and changes at the moment of transition, they're very unlikely to ever see those changes happen. And it's not just an absence of rights, it is the replication of a power structure that caused conflict in the first place. So you're not making long-term change. And so it might not feel as urgent. It's, you know, it's more conceptual, it's not as tangible as these other needs, but it is equally as important to creating lasting peace. So yes, women need to be at the negotiating tables. Women's rights need to be solidified and codified at the moment of transition. When these constitutions are being written, there's a whole literature on gender and constitution building. Use it, apply it. It's out there. I've been working in the space for 20 years. I've never seen active consultancies on it. They happen, obviously, but it's not a big field. And it should be. And this is the same thing. I mean, we're pouring this money into Ukraine, which, you know, it's an important cause, but we're not insisting on changing who's around those tables very much. And it's amazing. I mean, we've had in my previous position up in Ottawa, worked very closely with the Ukrainian Parliament, and we'd have Ukrainian MPs come in and talk to us, and the women are so eloquent, and they're so passionate about the change that they see, and yet they're not at the table. And I've spoken with some of the male Ukrainian negotiators who are in these negotiations, and some of them feel quite strongly that it's not a women's space, and they'll happy to say as much. That exists, and we're here. We're engaging with them. We're talking with them. We're financing things. Like, let's encourage those changes, not because we want to impose our cultural values on a different country, but because this is a human right that the countries themselves have committed to, that they state that they want to achieve, and because it will ultimately contribute to greater justice, to breaking cycles of conflict power. It's my 2 cents. But, and we've talked at lunch about this, but gender, you know, are we imposing cultural values? I get that a lot. All of the countries that we are invited to work in, we are invited to work in by states that are trying to better achieve the goals that they have subscribed to. The organizations that I work for are quite good at identifying when that request is insincere, and they won't go to work for countries that are looking for a rubber stamp. It can be a gray space. I've definitely sat down with political parties and with government actors who are like, oh, let's talk about quotas. How can I win? Like, how is this going to build my party in Parliament? I'm like, well, that's not really the point. But I always come back to the normative framework, to the legal framework. Countries have committed themselves to achieving certain gender goals, and that's what we're here to help them achieve, what they've said that they want to achieve. And to me, that's the fundamental basis of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Julia Santucci. I'm also a faculty member here at Congressional. And I guess I wonder, so when we're thinking about the world of democracy assistance, who's doing this well? Like presumably the United States is not, or even maybe we are. Like are there specific, whether they're US programs or other countries' programs, like what does success look like and is it happening anywhere?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's funny because I work on both sides of the board. I'm American Canadian now. And I've just done a research project where I interviewed both, and all the Americans are like, oh man, you must be really happy to be in Canada because they got it figured out. And like in Canada, they actually don't. They have their values in place, they have the language in place, but they don't have an infrastructure in place necessarily. The institutional resources that exist in the US are well beyond anything that most other countries have. Within USAID, there are dedicated units that are just there to try to capture knowledge, to share learning, to consolidate policy thinking. Like that's helpful. And likewise, that exists in other parts of government as well. And in Canada, not really. They're thinking about it. Next week we might hear more. But there's a lot of learning to be done, and to me, that should be a goal within the policy community today. So much credibility has been lost in the US over the years. Iraq and Afghanistan has democracy at the point of a gun. Not a good thing for democracy assistance, people who are far from that perspective. Everything that has happened since January 6th has been detrimental to confidence in democracy and confidence in Americans' ability to support democracy. But we have the knowledge, the resources, the commitment. We talk about democracy in a way that almost no other country will. We're not afraid to talk about it. We believe in it. We have an idealism that actually Canada even more hesitant about because it's risky, right? That needs to be shared. That infrastructure, that ability to manage these big projects, that attitude about how to engage confidently in high-risk political spaces, that's important, and other countries need to learn about it. And likewise for Canada, Canada's not afraid to use the F word. And I'll tell you, before they came in, like the F word was, both F words were the real one, the four-letter one and the feminist one. They were not allowed to be spoken in democracy assistance organizations. Actually, the four-letter one was probably used a lot more than feminism. And that has changed because we are listening to what's happening in policy spaces outside of the US, and it's changing those norms. So we're learning from each other. What actual success looks like on the ground in different countries, it varies. Scoring a country as democracy or not democracy, it's overly simplified. In some cases, I talked about Burundi earlier. I worked there for 15 years, and you watch the change in people's attitudes. Like at the start, when we were still in conflict, no one would look you in the eye, no one would talk, like forget about having a conversation about politics, about nothing. And over the course of 10 or 15 years, young people changed and people opened up, and there was dialogue, and there was journalism, and there was like all of this thing bloomed, and then it all fell apart in 2015. Does that mean that's a total failure? Whoops, we lost out? No, we've helped a generation of young people experience what democracy looks like, which is so important. So I also work in Congo. There was no memory of democracy. There's no memory of freedom or of rights. And so if you don't even have that in your mind in a population, like where do you go from? And so the current context in Burundi today is one where you're working in a very limited space, but with actors that will keep that seed alive and hopefully help it emerge in the future when the time is right.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you to our audience for coming. Thank you for your engagement and your questions. Thank you again to Sandy for all your hard work and feeding us. Most importantly, thank you to our guest, Dr. Gabrielle Bardall. It's such it's an honor for us to be able to host you, and we wish you the best of luck, and we hope that we continue to engage with you as you continue to move the ball forward in this area. And don't forget, join us next Wednesday when we host incoming history faculty members.